we could have like a smooth jazz radio show together. We both have like soft voices. We're gonna have people fall asleep to listen to this podcast.
When I was in middle school, I was very into clarinet.
Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Today I'm with a comedian. I recently just saw his showcased at Bad Jimmy's. I filmed it. First, let's start with Bad Jimmy's, a good comedy show. I'm here with Bo Johnson. He's a Seattle comic. He's a touring comic, which not a lot of comics can say. So congratulations for that, by the way.
Thank you.
Just from the set I saw you do on stage, I'm a fan, honestly. And previous guest, Chris, he has nothing but positive things to say about you. So
yeah, Chris is wonderful. Oh, thank you very much.
And thanks for making tea, by the way.
Oh, of course. I mean, it's your tea. I just put the kettle on after I didn't plug it in the first time.
It happens.
But
it happens.
yeah, you wanted to know about good comedy?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
So I'd say like probably around May of 2022, whenever the first summer, as like right as vaccines were starting to roll out with COVID. At that point, I think I'd maybe just started doing stand-up again after about 14 months off. And Chris, you mentioned, one of my best friends and the co-producer for Good Comedy, we kind of were looking at what was happening in other cities. Like the first stand-up I did after like coming out of the pandemic was in San Francisco, and I think I maybe had like 13 shows in about like 7 days being down there. And like one was outdoor. I think it was actually the last show at a public baseball field in a park. The next week, I think that park officials came and shut it down after it had been running for about 6 or 7 months.
What about the Fully Loaded tour? That's what fucking Bert Kreischer's doing on the baseball field shit.
Oh yeah, I think that's you have to be a little bit more resourced. I was mostly performing in public parks, some parking lots, some easements, but I was like, oh, look at all these outdoor shows here. And so Chris and I had kind of been driving around the city looking at like what is like a park that we could set up in without bothering too many people, or what are outdoor venues that we could use. And I had met one of the owners of Bad Jimmy's years ago, one of my other friends, Andrew Slater. One of the first times I met him, he'd kind of come up with one of the owners. He used to do stand-up as well, and so he did like one show inside their brewery, and he was kind enough to do like a viewing party when I had like my little clip air on Kevin Hart's show on Comedy Central. And so I'd met him a handful of times, and we were like, well, this is an easy like starting point to ask, like, can we do this? And then kind of it ended up being just a really awesome and supportive location in every way. It looks really beautiful, especially when the sun goes down. And so it's kind of been a monthly show there since May of that year. And we've had some great local people, some out-of-towners passing through, and it's kind of also allowed Chris and I to move into the Crocodile's new comedy club Hereafter, their bottom tier in the new venue that they established in Seattle. And beyond that, we've been able to partner with this company called The Nudge in Seattle and in Austin at this point, which is like an events recommendation service. And so we've produced our show for them, where they basically shoot out to all, roughly, depending on each city, like 40,000+ of their users. Hey, here's a comedy show to check out. And it's kind of let us do the show in a scale that wouldn't have been possible just on our own. And so it kind of went from being like, maybe we'll do this in like a park near Ravenna for free with the volume down low enough that we don't bother anyone in an apartment, to kind of something that's let us do some pretty cool things in Seattle and in Austin so far, and in venues that it would have been cool to perform in regardless, but it's felt more special kind of having built it with one of my best friends and it being our show.
That's super dope. So for like artists, whether it's like hip hop or pop or whatever, they start out at a small venue and then just have to work their way up basically until they build up enough of an audience. Is it similar for comedy? Or if you're just funny enough and like I've heard enough about like, like Mid-Seashore and like how she would like pass people at certain that club. What's the name of that club?
The Comedy Store.
Comedy Store.
Yeah.
My bad. So, but I don't know if that always meant that those comics she passed had a massive following versus if you're a hip hop artist or whatever, you kind of have to have that following before a club lets you in. And what is that like for comedy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at a lot of not all of, but some of the bigger clubs in the bigger comedy cities, not all of, but a lot of the people that perform there regularly definitely are like pretty famous comedians, if not like household names, are famous in the stand-up world. And so, yeah, I think the first place that I ever performed was an open mic in a Thai restaurant in Capitol Hill, Jai Thai. And I've been lucky enough to get to do a handful of like big venues. Probably the biggest show I've done, honestly, was not a good show for me. Like the most people in attendance was probably about maybe 4 years ago now, a year or two before the pandemic. I was booked to open for one of the opening slots for Lionel Richie at Merrymore Park, and I have like a longer story about that I'll do in my act, but it's like essentially like the best situation for comedy is that people are all going to a comedy show, maybe to see you, at least to see stand-up. It's hopefully a dark, full, packed room, and it's hopefully evening. And this was about, like, when I went on, around 3,000 people, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, like 70 degrees out, and everyone's drinking and eating and hanging out with their friends, waiting for Lionel Richie. And to the best of my knowledge, no one who had bought a ticket was expecting any comedy before Lionel Richie. And like when you have an opening act, I think any opening act, like I actually went to see the opening act. It was like the Heartless Bastards were opening for another band. And I was like, I'm here for them, but everyone else here is mostly just kind of, people are into it, but they're mostly chilling for who they bought their tickets for. And with music, you can kind of like still appreciate it happening and be doing your own thing. Obviously, it's not ideal if you're the musician on stage, but it still kind of is like, this is a nice thing. Whereas if stand-up is happening and you don't want it to happen, it kind of, stand-up doesn't work either. Then you're just a guy talking for about 20 minutes. And so that was like the most people I've ever performed for, but I kind of did it knowing this will be a cool thing to do. Like this is like a kind of unique experience, but I'm not expecting it to go well. But I did get to see Lionel Richie.
Did you get any laughs? I feel like people might like just zone you out at that point. Like,
I would say probably at least 50% of the people there were not paying attention.
Oh, man.
So
that's pretty crazy. But I feel like music and it's funny because I've been using the word artists for comedians now, honestly. So every time I say artist, I feel like I have to break down what type of art I'm talking about. But I feel like comedy and music go hand in hand almost. There's a lot of correlation with it. But I guess if it's going to be like a comedy music show, it has to say it's a comedy music show versus just like throwing a comedian up there.
I will say also, like, I know they did the same thing the next night in Portland, but it was in I'm blanking on the name of the arena, but wherever the professional basketball team plays, the
fucking Portland Trailblazers.
Yeah, wherever the Trailblazers play in Portland, it was in that arena, and I saw him like a year later, and he was like, it was incredible. It was dark. They had like a video on me. It was like one of the coolest nights ever. It's like, I hate you. I performed at a park at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And like when Lionel Richie rolls out, they've got his whole band. They've got like, they get video monitors on screen so you can see him the whole time. None of that's set up.
Right.
So I'm like, not only is it just like, no one's expecting stand up. At the time that I go on, I'm a little speck on the stage. You can hardly even see me, which honestly, with how I think it went about as well as it could have, but I was like, I'm all right with there not being large video footage of this happening.
That's funny. I feel like you could use it as a resume builder somewhat. I opened for Lionel Richie.
Yeah. I did not get to meet Lionel Richie. I did see him backstage, like pretty up close. I'll say like you can definitely tell, man, like money helps with aging for sure.
Shit.
Like it looks like they took him right out of the box still. Like I was like you can tell that he's old. Like he's moving great for how old he is, but like you can tell he's a little older in the same way that like my dad's 79 and in great shape. But like you can just see like the human body just shifts a little bit the way the weight carries, but like from a distance you'd be like, man, Lionel Richie looks the same.
Shout out Lionel Richie. But like even like Chris Rock, for example, he was on Busta Rhymes' last project he released. It was like 2021, and he like narrated the entire project. So you see comedians like actually go into people's projects and like do like skits and stuff. So that's kind of cool to see.
No, I think one of the things I've been thinking about lately, I think I've been trying to make a point of like as it fits in, like trying to make time to go to see more shows that aren't stand up. We're not just see shows that aren't stand up, but like make time to block off a night to not work and go to a concert that I want to see. And I mean, it's such an like obvious point that I think it's almost moot, but I've been like, what is the thing that like I'd never been to the Gorge before, and I only knew like 2 or 3 of her songs going to it, but I went with 2 of my friends and we saw Brandi Carlile. And I was like, she really threw down. It's like, it might have been that I did a lot of mushrooms. I don't think that was it, but I was like, this is maybe the best concert I've seen in my entire life. This is beautiful. This is absolutely marvelous. But I like saw some other bands, like Big Thief at the Paramount, and then some smaller shows just in Ballard. What was his name? There was Josiah Johnson, who used to be in The Head and the Heart. And I was trying to think about like, okay, so he was like with them until he separated and is now doing his own thing, and he was great. But I was like trying to think about what's made those shows and other shows I've seen, like what made them elevated from the other performers that maybe were also performing, who were also good. And it was like it was that they were great singers and they were good instrumentalists, but it wasn't that made it special. It wasn't that like they were that much of a better singer, is that they were like Brandi Carlile was so clearly having the time of her life. And like, or in another song you see someone like really experiencing whatever was on their mind when the song was written. And I was like, oh, what's making these shows special isn't just that they're talented musicians, but that they're present. And I feel like for me, when I look at the shows I'm doing and I'm like, what's the difference between being happy with how it went, like really being like, this is the way that I wanted to perform, and it's not even so much like did the jokes hit, but it's like if I just go on and I kind of am in a headspace where I hit play, and then it's over and I'm like, I just kind of did it.
You're the second person to say that in a week for me.
What my goal is. Like the goal is to perform the jokes in a way that I'm enjoying it, and to let myself have like the freedom to like follow something that happens that's different. And so like one thing I've been experimenting with, which I don't know if it's fully working or not, but I've been like, oh, what are some jokes that I have? And nothing is worse than like stand up being told out of context, but for the purpose of this, like I do a joke about how my parents are both massage therapists. I go like, that's why I sound like this. And how like when I was younger, kids would be like, oh, does your dad give you massages? I'm like, yeah, of course. And they'd be like, isn't that weird? It's like, no, he's my dad. Like, I'm not trying to bang my dad. They're like, thanks for telling me a little bit about you. And the end of the joke is about how like I went to a massage studio a few years ago. I went to a spa for the first time, and the masseuse was like, have you ever had a massage before? And I go, yeah, both of my parents are massage therapists. She's like, I'm worried this won't meet your expectations then. And I'm like, what do you think I'm gonna say? Like, that's not how daddy does it. And so like that joke, for instance, it was like I wrote that during the 14 months off, and one of my best friends, Jacqueline, we would talk on the phone almost every single day. Like we just have so many inside jokes. And she is a massage therapist now. She was in massage school at the time. And we were on the phone and she was like, I need people to like practice working on when I moved to Seattle. And I was like, I mean, if you need to, like, you can work on me. And she basically was like, I would be intimidated. Your parents are so good. And that's when I was like, what do you think I'm going to say? And so like when I'm on stage, and I have other jokes like that, but I'll kind of be like, okay, when I first wrote the joke and was telling it, like first going back out, it would be explosive, not only because like it just was consistent, but I was so excited to tell it.
Yeah.
And now it still works, but I've told it so many times that I'm like, it's not the same. And so I'll try to be like on stage and go, okay, what was it like when I was in Hamlin Park talking on the phone with one of my best friends and I just wanted to say something to make us laugh? And with a lot of the jokes, I can kind of like try to go like, I was in Matt's basement when this idea showed up, or I was on Jacob's like front porch talking about like applying for jobs and we had this dumb little one-liner.
Yeah.
So that's something I've been trying to do, to be like, what's a way to try to be more present telling these jokes and to enjoy telling them?
No, that's dope. I literally like one of the, I think it was Vox Rea. They just performed at Capitol Hill Block Party, and I had them on a few days ago, and they were saying the exact same thing about performing and how they need to work on being present, because sometimes by the end of the show it's over in an instant, you know. So like, but that means that you care about your craft. You know what I mean?
Well, I think it's like you try to think about like what is the goal in doing it, and for me, I'm like, what do I like about stand up, and why, like, what drew me to it? And it's not so much that it's like, oh, stand up is my favorite art form and I love stand up comedy so much, which I do, but it's like, oh, I like laughing with my friends. Like I like stuff that's funny. And for me, stand up happens to be the medium that it's the easiest to pursue that in a way where like it's kind of, with plenty of gatekeepers and challenges, still, but like the easiest, where it's kind of like there are fewer barriers to just doing it. Like you don't really need many resources. You just, like, that doesn't mean that the shows you're doing are good, but like you can just go into it. But yeah, it's like, how do I try to get funny the way that I am with the people I'm the most comfortable with? And like, how can you take these moments that, like, I don't know, when you're hanging out with your best friends and you're laughing about something, it's easy because everyone knows each other, and so you know the context of like why something is funny, because you know the history of like this person is like this, and so translating that, I think it's like almost creating the context for people to understand like a joke feels like the hardest part.
Right. I think it's funny that we could have like a smooth jazz radio show together. We both have like soft voices. We're gonna like have people fall asleep to listen to this podcast.
When I was in middle school, I was very into clarinet. Like,
I played the clarinet too.
Yeah, I loved clarinet. I was middle school all-state clarinet.
Oh,
I quit.
Shit.
I quit before high school. I threw it away. But the point I'm trying to make is, up until 8th grade, the only music that I listened to was jazz clarinet. And I don't know if you know much about jazz clarinet, but there's really only Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw.
Yes.
And so I was only listening to 2 clarinet players. It's a very short list of successful jazz clarinet players.
Yeah, shout out those two. That's
and
so funny.
I was like, at that point in time in 7th grade, I was like, it's going to come back. It's going to be me.
Yeah. I played clarinet for 7 years, so that's funny that we can connect.
Oh my gosh.
And then
you went even further than me.
Yeah.
Do you still have the clarinet at home?
That's funny. I actually when I graduated high school, to cut my ties from band and just focus on radio and media, I burned my clarinet. I put it in a campfire and burned it.
You burned it.
Yeah, I was like relieving
myself. It was
symbolic.
Yes.
Very.
Is that something where now, being older, you're like, that was kind of dumb, I could have just sold the clarinet? Or did it still feel emotionally resonant and important to do?
I think it was important, because I have a weird thing where, like, if the minute someone forces me to do something, I don't want to do it anymore.
Yeah.
So, like, after a few years in a band, I kind of felt like I was forced to stay in band. And then, like, similar to like reading. I don't burn books, but you know what I mean? Like I don't read that much because like by the time you reach high school, you're kind of forced to do like book assignments and all that. So now not really much of a reader or a clarinetist because I burned my clarinet. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I like that you're like the only reason I don't play clarinet anymore is because I burned it.
But so let's get into your background a little bit. Are you from Seattle or did you move here?
Yeah, so I grew up, I was born and raised in Lake Forest Park, suburb of Seattle. I was born in my parents' massage studio, actually. Home birth.
That's crazy. You're not a massage therapist then. The stars aligned for it.
Yeah. So I was born there, grew up in North Seattle, went to school, high school in Shoreline, and then went to college at University of Washington.
Hell yeah, man. What'd you go to school for?
I went for communications and comparative history of ideas.
Oh, what's comparative history of ideas?
That's like a build your own liberal arts degree.
Okay.
Which is really, I should have just done that because to be honest, I'm sure there are plenty of people who study communications and it means something to them, but to me I was like, I want to take all these classes spread around like the humanities. Yeah. And I need to get a degree too. But if I'm going to take all these scattered courses, I need to get a degree, which is pretty easy to get. And that's a horrible decision to make when pursuing an expensive education. If I were to go back and do it again, I don't know about who knows? I think go back. I think sometimes it's good to have, I would have done things differently, but also I like where my life is. I don't know if I would change things up too much because that's how you learn, but yeah, I don't think it was a wise decision.
When did you start comedy?
So I started watching stand-up in middle school. Okay. It was like I was mowing lawns a lot. I was doing a lot of like kind of, early middle school, high school manual labor for money. And the iTunes store had just popped up. And so I spent 8th grade was also the year where I stopped only listening to jazz clarinet. And the iTunes music store was like, I was at a new school, didn't have a lot of friends at that point yet. And so that was kind of like my basis of like what music was. I had like 2 friends and one of them told me, he was like, Aerosmith is great. And so I was like, all of my music in 8th grade was Aerosmith. And at that point in time, the Black Eyed Peas were exploding. So my iTunes library was like Aerosmith and Black Eyed Peas.
Boom, boom,
and like,
pow.
Yeah, exactly. And then also they were putting out all the Comedy Central like half-hour specials. So I spent like probably $1,000 on songs and all of these specials like Dimitri Martin, Mitch Hedberg. And that's when like in the back of my mind, I was like, I want to do this. But I think it took until getting out of college, I was like doing some writing projects with friends and it just kind of dropped off because the other people I was working with, and what was totally valid, were just kind of like, this isn't the amount of work I want to put into this. And so I was like, okay, well, I know that I want to work. I like this and I want to work really hard. And stand up, I was like kind of circled back to doing it. And I think I had wanted to do it for years, but I was trying to find a way to convince myself that I could do something without having to do the performing element of it. Because that's more frightening than just writing in your room.
100%. So what job did you get right outside of college then?
I was a busboy at Duke's Chowder House. Yeah.
So what were you going to college for? Like, what job were you trying to get? Or were you just going to college?
I wanted to be a busboy at Duke's Chowder House. I think that, honestly, I was a good student in high school. Like, I was good at being a student, and the subjects I did in college were not the hardest, but I was also good at being a student. And I think going into college, I just kind of thought, like, oh, you'll figure it out. And instead, I just did college and was like, oh, I didn't really find anything. Like, I'd had some I interned for some events companies. I knew I liked music and comedy, and so I like had, in the least important position, been involved with like the folks at UW that brought the bigger concerts to campus. And honestly, some of my takeaway was kind of like, I think I could tell that I was like, I'm stopping myself from actually doing this. And in some ways, working in event production with music and comedy, but doing none of the creative elements was almost worse than doing something I was completely disinterested in, because I was close enough to what I wanted to do without doing what I wanted to.
Put me
if
in,
that
coach.
Makes sense. Yeah. It would kind of be like, maybe like, I don't know how like NFL players feel when they have to hang up their jersey and then they're just like talking about football.
Right.
Like for some of them, I'm sure they still love it and that's so fun. But I'm sure in other cases they're like, man, I just have to watch people do like the thing that I spent my whole life like building myself up for. Now it's kind of past.
Mm-hmm. I can connect with that. I worked at 92.5 and I wanted to be a radio host, but I didn't want to go to school. Mm-hmm. And there was no radio broadcasting degree in Washington, so I got this job in high school right before I graduated, and I would have had to leave the station to go to broadcasting school. So I was like right next to the radio host. They all knew me. They almost became like my second mom and second dad. Like I was super close with them, and so I created a podcast as my way to be like get into media. Yeah. So I can see that with like being that close to comedy. But like I was in the fucking radio, so I was in the radio station, but I wasn't a radio host. So like being that close to comedy, but not doing it yourself, I can see how that might have pushed you to want to do comedy.
Yeah. So I think like I was at Duke's Chowder House. I was bussing tables, and I was like, honestly, now that I look back at it, minus the fact that was like physically the hardest job I've ever had to do, like have like 70 tables you're accountable for in the summer, pick up every dish. I was like, the only thing I've gotten better at is carrying a lot of plates. And that's like, I don't mean to like not putting down like that kind of labor whatsoever. Like the stuff that I do to make money is I just carry around chairs too. Like I like those jobs more than I like sitting in an office. And the people I worked with, I think are the like restaurant people are way cooler. It's way more fun. But I was like, I also wasn't doing anything outside of like working in a restaurant that meant something to me. So I was like, and the people who I saw in that industry who seemed the happiest either really cared about food in a way that like wasn't my thing, or liked bartending, or they had something separate that like that kind of work kind of allowed the flexibility for. And so I was like, well, I need to put focus on something. And that's when I started writing. That dropped off. And then before, I think it was January of 2015, I kind of had gone and watched 2 open mics, and I was like, I was a New Year's resolution comic. I was like, I'm going to do it one time. And then I did it one time, and I was like, okay, I'm going to keep doing this. And then started doing it like 2-3 times a week, and got an office job at that point, honestly, mostly just because I couldn't work nights anymore if I wanted to do this. And then started doing stand-up probably like 5 nights a week.
Wow. Damn. Do you see a lot of comics do that, or do you feel like you were kind of an exception? Because for music, at least, there's so many artists that want to do music, right? But at the same time, they don't want to sacrifice their personal life to just focus on music, right? And that kind of is kind of a little bit of like the lazy mindset of like, if I'm dropping a song maybe every couple of months sporadically or something, maybe something will catch. Versus like for me, I wake up, I'm checking music blogs. By the time it's 10, I'm already here at the studio, and everything I do is related to like even working with like you at Good Comedy or going on tour with Joe is because of my podcast, because I produce his podcast and everything like that. So everything relates back to my podcast versus a lot of creatives don't know how to make that their full-time thing, or they're kind of lazy about it. So did you kind of feel weird about like solely focusing on comedy that much? Did you feel like an outcast, or did you see other people doing that as much?
I mean, I think that like I was blessed in a way that at that point in time, a lot of my best friends, the people that like I loved the most, had kind of moved away from Seattle. And so I didn't feel like I was sacrificing a social life in the way that I would have been otherwise. Like they're definitely like when my friend Matt would come home for holidays, I'm like, well, I want to see Matt because Matt's here. Right. But I was like, the people that I would be choosing to spend the most time with just they're not here. It's not even an option to be around them. And so that was easier. In terms of I think that most people who get better at stand-up do that. I think that like what people's creative goals are and what you want to get out of any kind of an art form is different.
Right.
And so there's nothing wrong with doing it a handful of times each week or here and there. But I think if you want it to be a job, and that doesn't mean have it feel like a job, but if you want to get to a point where you're doing it professionally, I was like, I'm going to have to treat this seriously, and I am going to have to do it not only when it's fun to do it. And I think like there's a balance in life that's important, not only for, at least for me, trying to do more stand-up, but also just being a happy person.
Right.
Like, I don't want my whole life to be in basements. I want to see friends. I want to go to concerts. I want to be outside too. But it definitely does mean like treating it seriously. Like when I was in college, I was working on a house with my dad, and we were working in the laundry room, like just kind of doing light. Like my dad did carpentry for a while, built houses for a while, so we're just doing some work like that. And he had been, when he got out of college, before getting a master's degree, he did like the second year of the Peace Corps. He was in Bolivia, came back. That's how he was able to afford going to university at that point in time. Like Peace Corps sponsored it. And then he worked in local government for a few years and was like, I'm miserable. I'm smoking cigarettes. I'm drinking. I hate this work. Nothing's changing. And so he started flipping houses, and he built a sailboat. And for years, he would flip houses for part of the year, and then he would sail for 6 months and not work and go out with either, whoever he was in a relationship with, eventually my mom. And that was kind of like my cool dad story. It's like, oh, my dad built a boat. But I was in that little like laundry room with him, and it was like, how long did it take to build the boat? Because I'd told that story for years, but I'd never really thought about the actual, like, what did that mean? And he was like, it probably took about 5 years for the boat to like start from like not knowing anything about building a boat, period, to like it being able to be on the water. Maybe another 2 years before it was like not only on the water, but like glossy and finished. And then every year after that, like as soon as you put a boat in water, it starts to sink, like maintaining it. And he would live on the boat too. And so I was like, oh, that's the thing that he did that I thought was so cool when he was younger. And I was like, whatever my boat is probably going to take a minimum of 5 to 7 years of really hard work. Like something that means like that much or feels that cool, it's going to be special not only because like I just snap my fingers and it's there, but like it's going to take effort and time and dedication.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes I get frustrated that that's so true though, like sometimes you do want success right away, but it does take time. That's a good point. Fuck, that was an amazing story and analogy. Holy shit.
I remember, I was going to say I'm embarrassed, but I like Jack Johnson.
Yeah. Banana Pancake.
Not the only music I like, but that's a great song. Feel good music. And I think like before I started doing stand-up, I was living with my folks for about a year. And I would take the bus into the city, and then I would walk 30 minutes to Duke's Chowder House, right? So I would listen to comedy podcasts. I listened to, at that point in time, a lot of like Comedy Bang Bang. This comedian Pete Holmes had a podcast called You Made It Weird. And I remember, I think he had an episode with Jack Johnson where he was talking about, like I said, middle school. All I knew, I don't know, it was middle school or high school. I still was like not that aware of like what popular music was. And I remember Jack Johnson became huge, and like for me, not knowing who he was, I was like, all of a sudden, the biggest musician in the country is just some guy with an acoustic guitar. And he was talking about like, oh, there's this perception that I became big out of nowhere. And he's like, at that point, when all of a sudden we became visible, I'd driven across the country like 10 times in a van with my band performing for empty rooms. And he had a point about like, with music, you can kind of have this one hit and then disappear. And he was talking about like just his theory of the longer it takes to reach your height is also like the length of your sunset, if you will. So he's like, I'm no longer at the peak of like the biggest I'm going to be as a musician. Like the height of my fame, the height of my success is gone. But because there were years of work getting there, I now get to enjoy like a longer, like sustained career.
Damn, that's dope.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Do you feel like you've had to sacrifice friendships and family at any point of your career though? Or do you feel like you've been pretty good at managing that?
I mean, I think that unfortunately it has been like, a lot of my life. Yeah, I think there are a lot of experiences that I've had that are incredible and very special, like places I've gotten to be, shows I've gotten to do that are kind of a dream come true from when I was like fantasizing about this in middle school, but definitely have also missed a lot of parties or going out or just like spending every night with friends. And because I mean, the reality of the situation is like, I'm not going to have a full-time job for that much longer because I have a lot of savings and I can hopefully kind of subsist, but I won't be making like a real living. So, I mean, this whole time I've been working 40 hours a week plus whatever comedy is. And when it was just doing open mics, I also was younger. I was like 24 when I'm starting. Now I'm 30. So you get a little bit tired easier, but it also was like, just doing open mics. In some ways it's like you'd have to wait to, like, I'm lucky enough now that I often kind of can walk on to an open mic in Seattle, or I can just show up and go up and leave. But like to start, I would like get to this Thai restaurant at like 7:00 so I could sign up at 8:30 and then perform at 9:45. And so you're like spending like more of my time is waiting than doing comedy. But yeah, just the amount of time, it's like and as you start to work more and work the road more, have more shows or produce more shows locally, it's like maybe I'm making more money and I'm performing more in the thing that I want to do, but it's not like I get to work 15 hours less at my day job.
So I also just had he's a third-time guest on the podcast, Greg Cypher. Shout out Greg. He talks about how he kind of had this huge like run in Seattle in the early 2015, and now he's coming back up and like he's getting all these cool shows. He just opened for Method Man, I think. Was it yesterday? Oh, cool. His music's starting to take off because he was in a hip-hop duo, so now he's doing a solo career and it's starting to take off, which is really exciting. But he works in the restaurant industry, and he talks about like he'll perform a show that's sold out, and then he has to go back to work where he's almost like a zero. Yeah. So what's that like for comedy? Do you like your job, and does it kind of relate in any way to comedy?
Not really. So I work at a food bank in Seattle, and I've worked there for about 7 years now, and I would say that I do like it, and it's meant a lot to me at certain times of my life, and I think it's shaped some of the things that I care about, and especially during the pandemic when kind of like I had actually quit my job in March 2020 to like take a year, move back in with my folks, and focus on stand-up full-time. And that obviously did not pan out very well. I went to Oklahoma City, and I remember watching like the country shut down, and like I remember like seeing the NBA cancel on TV and being like, oh, this is like pretty big. Because whenever money starts to get canceled, and like money doesn't have morals for the most part, so this is a serious thing. So went home. All of my shows that had been lined up, I had already canceled or had canceled, and I'd moved out of my apartment and got my job back at the food bank, and that was an in-person job. My parents are both, my dad is in his late 70s, my mom's in her 60s, and so I was like, well, I can't really even live in my childhood room if I'm going to work, so I moved into their now closed massage studio on the other side of the house.
Oh, wow.
And lived there. It was like, and had like a pretty rough breakup. And so I was like, oh man, all of these things that kind of I'd cared a lot about were gone within about 2 weeks. Like this relationship, someone I was in love with, like the year that I'd kind of pictured for myself. And all of this would I was very fortunate. I had a place to stay. I had income. Like nothing was that bad for me. But I was like, that job meant a lot in that moment where it's like good to have some sense of purpose. And I think now kind of reaching the tail end of when I'll be there, I've been there for too long.
Yeah. How'd you end up working at a food bank? And did you use your college degree for that?
I don't think that you need a college degree to do the job that I have. And I think that the place I work is actually in a way that is like positive, kind of realizing that a college degree is not a requirement for positions, like just ability and being a rational, caring person are. But at the time, I think it did help. It was, it helped me get a job that I made less money at than bussing tables at a restaurant.
That takes dedication though, to work for a job for 7 years. Damn.
Yeah.
Has it flown by though, or has it felt like a grind working there?
It depends in different times. I mean, I think it's like rationing out vacation. That's the biggest thing is I think I've just reached a point where how busy I am doing stand-up and how much time I need to be on the road, it's just not sustainable or possible to do both. And if I need to make more money again at the end of the year, I'll have to figure out what a more balanced way to live is. But yeah, I think that for me at least, having stability has made doing stand-up easier.
Right.
Especially, and I think that one of the things that will be a challenge when my entire livelihood and life is of work is all comedy, is that stand-up is a lot of highs and lows, talking about going into a restaurant after you perform this sold-out show. And when it's going well and you're in the pocket and you're feeling creative, it's the best feeling in the world. Have you ever gone boogie boarding or surfing or anything like that?
Yes.
When I don't even know what it feels like to really catch a wave in a real way when you look at a good surfer. But even just to I've taken some surfing lessons, and I remember the few times you get up, you're like, wow, I'm the king of the ocean. And then I've seen a photo of me on that wave, and I was like, this not even a wave in sight. It looks like I'm on a lake. But when you catch it's this free floating ride where everything else lifts away and you're just for a moment getting pushed along by the ocean, that's very cheesy. But when you're in the pocket on stage doing stand up, I think that's the only feeling I can think of where it's comparable. And so it's the best. But other times, just everything that's worked doesn't work anymore. All of the new jokes don't work. Some of the shows are just so depressing or bad, or you're man, I flew across the country to lose money and do bad. Yeah. Not only did I lose money, but I did bad too. And now I'm in a dilapidated condo feeling bad about myself. But when you have a day job, it's at least there's this other purpose or thing.
Yeah.
And so I can't, I think especially those first few years when you're mostly doing open mics, first 6 months I was doing stand-up, I feel I was going to these open mics every single time knowing I was going to do bad. And I still wanted to do it. I was excited to, but it's the evidence was there, and I was I'm going to bomb.
Yeah.
And I'm showing up, and I'm going to do bad, and that's kind of just a part of the process, I think. And then slowly it would be oh, maybe after 6 months, there's a 50% chance I'll do good.
Yeah. Yeah, that just kind of proves to me that this first is going to sound wild until I explain. But what you just said just kind of proves that I'm kind of a pussy. So basically, I realized that and this is I feel like I say this in the most positive way for myself.
Yeah.
I like to control situations, but not people by any means. So I just want to make just control situations for myself. So like, I have all this podcast stuff, but it's in a controlled environment. If I ever do live audience podcasts, it's because I'm counting on my guest a little bit to pull, and I've done enough research to know that the guest can pull, and then however many people I can pull, it's just kind of like a second thought because I'm banking on my guest, right? So I've never been in a situation really yet where I've had to worry about, am I going to bomb or not?
Yeah, I mean,
which is a weird experience.
You could definitely frame that as being a pussy, or that could also be strategic and smart because you're in a medium that maybe control is a little more possible too. Whereas if I was like, I'm only going to perform for sold out shows with great audiences that want to see me, I just never would have been able to do it. And I think like I'm kind of reaching the point where some of the things you're talking about do feel more personal. Like I definitely was lucky the first few years of doing stand-up where I got some cool opportunities and I got some credits that generally are not that common being based in Seattle. But
Lionel Richie.
The big one for me was, I remember there's a really funny comedian, and he owns a comedy club down in Tacoma now, Nate Jackson.
I've had him on the podcast.
Yeah. So I didn't know who Nate was at this point in time, and someone shared a Facebook post of Nate's, and it was like, if you care about stand-up and you want to have a future in this as a career, this is an opportunity you don't want to miss. And not knowing who Nate was, it kind of almost like sounded like when you go on Craigslist and someone's like, do you want like a TV opportunity to be famous? You're like, this is like a scam. But I was like, knowing him, I was like, I wouldn't have thought that. But not having any idea, I was like, okay, whatever. And so I submitted to it. And at that point in time, my best friend from high school and I had done this prank where we kind of just filmed it for our friends and people liked it. So we put it on YouTube and it went kind of viral, where we snuck into a movie theater as one person with him wrapped around me. And we'd been on like, Nick Cage had a show called Caught on Camera with Nick Cannon. No, not Nick Cage. Nick Cannon. Very different people. Very, very different. He had a show called Caught on Camera with Nick Cannon on NBC, where our little stunt was featured on that. We got interviewed. And so I had this like credit that made me sound more credible than I was. It had nothing to do with doing stand-up, where I'd been doing it for like a year and a half. But I was like, I've been on NBC. And so I got this audition slot. And I think it was me and maybe 20 of us total, I want to say. And it ended up being an audition for this show Kevin Hart had called Heart of the City on Comedy Central. And went up last, auditioned for it. It was kind of like, this is a cool experience. Like, what an awesome thing to get to do, but I'm not going to get it. And a year later, or not a year later, but like 4 or 5 months later, I got a call and she was like, you're going to be on Heart of the City. We need to start the paperwork now. What's your social security number and your name? And I gave it to her, and then we hung up, and I was like, did I just get my identity stolen? But like, I had stuff like that where I was lucky, but it didn't really, things like that didn't shift. Like, I was still mostly on shows where the people running the show were responsible for people showing up. And now, like, being on the road and headlining a bit more, and kind of having this slowly growing like social media audience, mostly on Instagram. It's the first time in my life that like people are coming to see me specifically. Not a ton, but like depending on the city, maybe like 10 to 30 to 40, maybe or maybe in the city that I've picked not well, 1 or 2, you know, but where I think if I do a show where like there are only 10 people, that hasn't happened yet because I'm also spending money on ads, but like it'll feel more personal. Like when you rent the venue and no one shows up, it feels sadder than when a club has booked you and you're like, oh man, this club didn't do a good job. It's like, oh, I didn't do a good job. No one wants to come.
Yeah, that's what's I've been really like aligning myself with comedy. I'm not saying I want to do comedy, but just aligning myself with, like, the characters in comedy. And like I really love Andrew Schultz, and like I don't know if you've paid attention to his newest special, but like the biggest thing he said about it is because he bought it back from a major distributor. He hasn't said if it was Netflix or whatever, but he bought it back, almost went bankrupt for it, and then made 3 times back by selling it on his own website. Yeah. And he's like, the scariest thing for a creative is actually figuring out what their worth is. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think it's like people will be like, "What's your rate?" Yeah. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, what would I do it for? Very little. What should I ask for? Or it's like, I think that's like where imposter syndrome comes in too, where it's kind of like, I feel like sometimes you show up. Like I remember one of the most fun weekend of shows I've done. I went to Chelan with my friend Aaron was opening for me, and there's this production couple, Rotten Apple, which is like owned by these really cool people that used to be LA based and live in Chelan now. And there was like at this old historic movie theater, the Ruby Theater, and you see like all these people come out, like, and I'm like, they all spent money to see me do this for 45 minutes. You're like, just see me talk. Like, am I going to ruin their weekend? 'Cause it's like sometimes hard to realize, oh no, like, look at all of the work that I have done to get here versus just being like, there's a lot of stuff that's gotten here. Like, I think before a big show, I don't know if I always will follow a set list. Like, some of it will often be the same, like the beginning or the end or something. But like, I don't necessarily go joke by joke by joke by joke, but it'll be like, it's helpful for me to write it out or to look at like a physical copy of something I've written, just to like, as a reminder, all of these jokes are here. You've done this for 45 minutes before. Yeah. Because otherwise I'm like, I'm just going to go out there and talk for 45 minutes. Like, all these little sentences are going to add up to that long. That's
what's crazy is my first live audience podcast, I had like 100 people show up, which is
that's awesome.
But to like actually, that was my first taste of having like people there for the podcast. And you'd think it'd be scary, but like you feel like it kind of like recharges you to like see people like react to what you're saying. Or like I would talk to the audience while I was doing the podcast as well and be like, do you guys agree with this or whatever?
And that's cool.
I'm getting a little bit of that taste. So like when you're doing a good show, you're probably like, you feel like you're on fire when you're doing
that. Yeah, it feels great.
That's crazy.
But I'd say it feels way worse to have a bad set in front of a lot of people than an empty room. The worst bomb is like if everyone else has done good. Oh, because then you're like, it was me.
Is it hard to come up in comedy in Seattle? Because for artists, it's kind of a hard deal. But what is it like for a comedian?
I mean, I think that it is. When I was starting, I think it was a good city for me to start in, at least. So like there were lots of open mics. There was kind of a pathway to getting on like indie shows and getting up more. Like I worked the door at the Comedy Underground that's now closed. That was like my home club for years. So in that element, I think it's a good city to learn how to be funny and to have the opportunity to get stage time. But I think on the same end, and this is maybe shifting a little bit in the sense that like with TikTok and Instagram and YouTube, and the way that like, I don't know, the algorithm still also seems uncontrollable and not necessarily bound by like what the best material is, but there is like a path now to getting some kind of a following that is not as traditional of like be in LA, be in New York, get on TV, where like I think having a set that aired on Comedy Central has helped a lot in the sense of like it was felt like emotionally huge, and it was like something where that makes you kind of believe in yourself a little bit more. And it's been a credit that's helped me get booked on other things, or I can put it on ads, stuff like that. But in terms of like actually, it wasn't like I was on TV and I had a following. Like maybe I've had maybe one person who I didn't know recognize me from that. Wow. And I think maybe I got like 5 or 6 new followers
That's it from Comedy. Oh my gosh. Wow.
And I think it's different now when like they put the sets on like social media and you're tied to it. But like, I don't mean that in a way to discredit it or to say like it wasn't like a really incredible experience or that I wasn't really fortunate. But like it wasn't like I was on TV and now I have a career. I also was lucky to get a credit like that when I was like 2 years into doing stand-up. But the reality of it also was that like being on TV didn't make me better at stand-up than I already was. Like, it wasn't like I got a TV credit and I was qualified to headline a show. I was still someone who only really had 10 to 15 minutes of material.
But nowadays, that kind of means everything. Like, you have one funny reel on TikTok, and then
it can help. Yeah.
It's a weird thing.
But like now I feel like I've kind of, after maybe 7-ish years of working at this, I feel like I've kind of grown into some of the credits that I got years ago.
So do you wish you had those opportunities now instead, or are you kind of happy you got them early?
I think that I'm not going to say like it was all luck. I think that would be unfair, but I definitely was very lucky for those things to happen in Seattle for me, especially that early on. Those are like credits that some people who work very hard and who are very funny never get over the course of their whole life. And so to get them 2-3 years in was like something that I did not take for granted and didn't feel like I also at the time nor now felt like I was the best comic in Seattle or the person who deserved the credit the most. I just happened to be lucky enough to be in the position to get the audition, and I delivered a good audition. And so I got an opportunity. Like, I did the things and I did the work that got me there, but it wasn't because there weren't other people who would have been more ready or more deserving. It just happened the way that it did.
Is comedy about, because music's all about connections, is comedy similar?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. I think like most of not all of, but like when I look at the clubs that I've gotten to headline or feature in or opportunities, most of it has come from a friend being like, do you want to open for me on the road? Or I'm going to recommend you to this booker. Like most of the things that have come have been from friendships in stand-up or something like producing these shows with Chris, these bigger ones. That's because of like our relationship together. And it's because of like, and I also look at just like jokes I've written. It's like not all, some of them are things where like maybe I did write it all on my own, but the other jokes were like I pitch it to a friend and they have a tag or something. And I think that I look at the friends that I have who I think are immensely talented, and being friends with them makes me feel like, oh, maybe I do belong in this. Like,
so what are the next steps for you? So you're saying you're hoping to leave the food bank soon, and then what do you do to make sure you can maintain just doing comedy? Is it just by continuing to write until you slowly build a bigger audience, or how does that work to like to completely live solely off comedy?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking a very good question. I think that some of it is just that it is going to involve a little bit of like the unknown, and I'm fortunate enough to be in a position where, because for the last few years before the pandemic, I was paying not like my whole life with, but I was covering rent with stand-up, that I've been able to like build enough of a nest egg that I feel like I can invest in myself. But I think it is like, I want to see if I strip all of the energy that goes into working 40 hours a week, and like for me to be creative, I feel like I need to have space in my brain. I need to have time to be bored. I need to have time to like be a person and go on walks. Like, I'm hoping that that will help with not only writing more, but also just, I know kind of what some of the goals are in the next year. Like, I'd like to work towards recording like an album. I'd like to tape something, hopefully. And I feel like to do that, I need to be able to just consistently do stand-up on the road and do longer sets more often. Because often it would be like, oh, I get to headline shows for 2 months, and then I finally feel like I'm in the pocket of doing 45 minutes of material, and then I don't do that for 6 months, and I kind of have to relearn, because it's different to do a 10-minute set, 15-minute set than like the pacing of like 45 minutes, and being comfortable doing it. And so that's a piece of it, and some of it is just hoping, like, social media feels like kind of such a gross thing to be obsessed with, but it also has been the thing that has, more than anything in the last couple of years, changed things for me in the last like 6 months. Like, I had started at the beginning of the pandemic, I posted like stand-up every day on TikTok for a month to, I would say, minor success, like enough where I had some clips get like enough views that it was cool for me, like maybe like 600,000, whatever. I think I had maybe like at that point like 20,000 followers, like nothing that's major on that app, but like enough that it's like, this is something. But what had happened is like, I burnt out. I ran out of all of my material because I'd only had whatever recordings I had before the pandemic. And so I started recording a lot of stuff this last year. I invested in like all of the money I made off a big show that Chris and I had run. I put into buying like a 4K camera, and started recording a lot of stuff. And in the new year, it was like, I'm going to post one reel each week. And I know some people do more than that, and that's great. But I was like, what feels sustainable to me for hopefully a year? Or if I have to cut back, I could do twice a month. But like, I think like between crowd work or a riff and the jokes I've already written, I can do this for a year. And let's just like, no other opportunities are coming my way. I'm in Seattle. Like, I kind of have to try this on my own. And was fortunate enough that like a couple of those clips just started popping off. And I started with around like 1,700 followers going into the new year. And now I'm sitting around like 28,500, which is like pretty cool for me. And it's like, that's where I'm starting to see real people show up to shows. And it's not at a tipping point where like that's a living, but I'm like, this is pretty cool. And I think it's like reaching a point now where I've been trying to separate kind of like some of the realities of being an adult from how I would feel about this, not thinking about those realities as just like a kid. Because like I look at like being in college, and I remember like my roommate showed me this comedian Mike Birbiglia, and that's kind of how we became friends, was like watching this guy together. And then like these jokes, kind of you share them with other people. And I was like, that's the dream. It's like people, like someone bringing someone to, like, even if it's just like one person bringing their friend to see me, I'm like, that's kind of like what would have been a total dream come true as a kid. And that still has meaning, even if it's not enough to sustain like a full life yet.
But it's got to be a little bit of excitement and
it's
nervousness
so cool.
at the same time, you know?
It's also like one of my best friends was in town a few months ago, and I don't think I'd ever really thought about this before. I was like, I think this is maybe the first year where I'm like, oh, this might pan out. Like, I think that I maybe had thought like, oh, I probably eventually could maybe find a way to make a living doing this, but I don't think that there was any kind of like a visible pathway of what to try doing. And the pathway is not really fully there, but it's like the first year I'm like, maybe this actually has a real chance.
Are you able to talk to comedians who are doing this full time? Are they able to give you any advice, or have you surrounded yourself with those type of people?
I think it's so different. Like my friend Andrew, who is the first person to really take me on the road with him and get me these longer, like 30-minute sets. He has kind of a life that if that was where I ended, I would be very happy to have the life he has now. Like has a home, has a wife. Like, I don't know if I want a kid, but he has a kid and he makes a full-time living doing stand-up. And I'm like, that would be a dream come true. But like the ways to make a living are so different. Like it could be that your album gets played on Sirius, so you get royalties and you keep putting out new albums. It can be that you perform at colleges, which pay better. It could be that you work on cruises. And so I think it's like what I'm seeing people doing and what feels like the path that I'm pursuing right now is I would like to do some of those things. Like I would like to record an album. It would be great if it gets played and I get some money from that. But I want to try to build like a real audience and people who want to see me. And I want to be able to work with people that I like and I care about and I love.
Yeah.
And that involves doing a lot of things on your own, like self-producing a lot of shows. And that is its own separate work from stand-up. And it's like almost a whole different job, but it feels like that is maybe kind of like one of the pathways.
And then also once you like figure out, like I tell a lot of my friends that like as an artist you want to have like multiple ways of income, right?
Yeah.
And at first you have to do everything, but then once for this may be specifically for like a musician, but like after a while, like if a record label reaches out to you, you know what you can offer and if what they're offering is actually valid because you already know how to do some of those things.
I think it's also just like I try to have some faith in the sense that some of the things that have happened for me through stand-up over the last 7 years are things I never would have imagined. Like, it's not something I would have come up with. Like, I got, like, for instance, like, just a little thing. Or you look at I think it's interesting to look at, like, the pathway of what leads to the next. So I saw this random Facebook post, and because of that, I went to this audition. Because of the audition, I was on Comedy Central. Because of that, I got to go to this festival in Montreal just for laughs and record another set for Kevin Hart's like digital network. Because of that, I met this woman, Jill Kimmel, who was friends with my friend Andrew, and I then met her again when I was featuring for him in Glendale, Arizona, and she hosted the show just because she wanted to hang out. And I was in the same room when she was like, want to do this festival to Andrew? And she's like, you could do it too. Because of that, I went to Las Vegas and they did this like festival sponsored by Zappos. And I met this guy, Tony, who had founded Zappos and was like, really liked my stand-up and was became a friend and was like, come back and do Life is Beautiful. And so I got to do this festival in Las Vegas. And I go, all of these little things led to that. And then even things that were like, opportunities that either I gave up or didn't pan out. Like maybe there was a club where I didn't want to work there anymore because of the way people were being treated. I go, okay, well now I have to run more of my own shows. So I learned how to run a show. And then there's a pandemic. And so Chris and I are kind of forced to like create this thing just out of necessity, which has since then kind of allowed us to do shows at a scale that like we never would have been able to do. Otherwise is just like, without that almost being something that we had to do. And it's kind of led to some of the cooler things that have meant more in comedy.
Well, I'm excited for your career path, and it seems like I have faith in you.
Yeah.
You know, we've only met twice, but I have faith. You got a fan here. What is some advice that you'd give to up-and-coming creators, artists, influencers, comedians?
I mean, I don't know if this is very inspirational, but I feel like it was the thing when people are like want to talk about doing stand-up because they're thinking about it, and I think it maybe applies to all of these other, like any other dream someone has. What was comforting to me going to the first 2 open mics before I performed for the first time was kind of realizing like, oh, nobody else cares. And that later becomes the challenge to overcome. But the initial first step is I was like, I've been thinking about in some way or another doing stand-up since I was in 7th grade. And now I'm 22 years old and I've been fantasizing about this thing for years. And doing one open mic means the world to me and nothing to absolutely everyone else. So like for me to go up and do 1 3-minute set feels like years of process is coming into fruition. But the reality of it to everyone else in there is like, here's another guy who came to an open mic anyone can sign up for who did 3 minutes. And how it goes to me means something, but means nothing to anyone else. Like, unless you go up and say something like truly hateful and awful, no one's going to remember what happened. So all you need to do is like be a mindful, thoughtful, kind human, go up and you bomb. Doesn't matter whatsoever.
Yeah.
And I think like seeing like, oh, it matters to me, but no one else, was kind of freeing, where I was like, oh, it's okay if it doesn't go good.
Yeah.
It's okay if it goes great, that's awesome. But it also kind of, there's no meaning attached to it. And so I think like if you want to do it, just having giving yourself the freedom to try. And I think the same applies to like once you're making art, putting it out there now, where like that was what was scary this year in terms of like, I'm going to put these jokes online, because it can be painful if like no one watches it, no one likes it. And I've had that happen on other platforms, but it's like, it almost like kind of feels embarrassing. I don't know when it became embarrassing to try. I feel like, oh, look at someone's, it's like, no, there's nothing embarrassing about trying. Like that's what we're all trying to do.
Yeah, 100%. You're really good at analogies, my guy.
Oh, thank you.
And you're a cool dude. So
hopefully we didn't put people to sleep with our tea and our
oh my God, we're literally drinking tea, soft voices, smooth jazz. We started talking about clarinets. Like,
yeah.
But yes, this has been a great episode. I've been wanting to have you on for a few months now, so I'm happy.
Oh, thank you for reaching out. It's been a pleasure.
Of course. What is the easiest way for people to reach you?
You can find me online at Bo Johnson Comedy on Instagram and TikTok.
There we go. This has been the NAST podcast with
Bo Johnson.
And we did it.